There was one thing that I talked about yesterday that I want to stress today in greater depth, and that is the importance of what we are doing to produce that kind of right environment that is stronger than willpower, that right environment that really can change, I believe, the course of destiny, as we were talking again yesterday. Communities, as Yogananda called them, world brotherhood colonies. In fact, he was so enthusiastic for this whole idea that no matter what his given topic, he would always get onto this one as quickly as he could and stay as long as possible. I've always laughed about his lecture on my visit to Assisi, and the lecture consisted almost entirely of a long talk on world brotherhood colonies, at the end of which he said, "And so the thing is, when I went to Assisi," and he spent 2 minutes winding that one up. So it seems appropriate for several reasons that I talk on this subject, because it is to a very great extent the essence of what we are doing. By that I mean that we don't only want to stress a beautiful philosophy. We want to make that philosophy practical. We want to bring it down out of the clouds of theory, out of the clouds of mountain caves where a few people practice and other people sigh wistfully down in the cities. We want to bring it down into the cities and help people to change. And this is necessary. For this, it is necessary that we concentrate that energy and not just make it an admonition that people can practice only in the sanctity of their own homes. It is a fact of history that nothing has ever been accomplished until a few people, and usually it's been only a few, have concentrated a new wave of energy, a new state of consciousness, a new dream, concentrated it, and then by that concentration created such a vortex of magnetism that suddenly everybody said, well, of course, why not? And everybody was doing it. If you look at history and at the great movements of history, you will find that this has been the case, I think, without exception. It's rather an extreme statement to say without exception, but I can't think of an exception. The obvious examples are the religious movements, where we find Jesus and a few disciples who changed the course of Western civilization. They were discounted as non-entities at the time. If the emperor in Rome ever heard of the crucifixion of Jesus, he would have saying, "Oh yes, so which Jesus?" He wouldn't have known anything about it. People living at his time, right there probably in Israel, weren't aware of the wave that had been created. But there was a focus to that wave, there was a power behind it. And because of that power, it grew. And gradually, over a few hundred years, it became the leading force in Western civilization. It became the saving grace of Western civilization when all the Vandals and all the Goths and so on, the barbarians came down from the north and sought to destroy. They sought to destroy, and they themselves became converted. What in fact changes the course of history is not force, ever. It's ideas. It's an interesting thing. If you go to the meaning of blessed are the meek, it doesn't mean meek. It says gentle. Blessed are the gentle. Other translations say gentle. Those who exercise not force, not physical violence, but the gentle force of private, deep-seated conviction. These are the ones who inherit the earth. Their ideas are the ones that obtain. The pen is mightier than the sword. Buddha lived a lot longer than Jesus. He had many more disciples, and yet even they were nothing compared to the numbers of people living in his country, and yet they changed the entire East. Buddhism is basically the religion of the East, except in India. And we find that with every major change, every major thrust, every meaningful movement, even if it hasn't been in religion, it's always been from a focus of energy, and a focus that has come from a few people concentrating their energies. Even I think of something perfectly mundane, like the left bank writers and artists after the First World War. If Gertrude Stein had settled in Dublin, well, not Dublin, because there were a lot of writers there too, but let's say Saskatchewan, and if Ernest Hemingway had gone to Miami Beach, and if all of these different people had scattered to different points of the compass, I don't think they would have had anything like the impact that they had being together and relating to one another. People are people. They're not all that different. What is it that makes it possible for a period like the great music geniuses of Germany? What made them so outstanding? To a large extent, it was because they were relating to each other. One of the things that I read that a friend of ours sent to me when I was in Italy that I was very pleased with. I said this to you the other day, those who came to my class, but it was an article in answer to that really outrageous movie about Mozart, Amadeus, that doesn't tell anything about Mozart and tells a great deal about this second-rate composer who lived with him at that time. And out of his jealousy for Mozart, for example, how could Mozart say he loved his music? But because he couldn't say it, naturally this mediocre musician, composer, got the impression and gave the impression to others that, in fact, Mozart was just so pettily proud of his own that he couldn't appreciate anything good that anyone else did. And there was a lovely story about Mozart when he was listening to a new work by Haydn. And another composer who was always putting other composers down, chopping off their heads to make himself look taller. And he leaned over at a certain point after a certain passage had been played in an unusual way and sort of sneeringly said, "I wouldn't have done that." And Mozart answered, "Neither would I, but it's because neither you nor I could have had the imagination to conceive of such beauty, such a wonderful way of resolving that particular passage." He was a great man. He was not a petty man. You can hear that greatness in his music. And the point here is that they knew each other, and they appreciated each other, and they fed energy back and forth to each other, and that's what produced that glorious music that came out of that whole era in Germany and Austria at that time. If we look at the Renaissance, it began in Florence, in Italy. Florence at that time was a small town of about 50,000 people. All those people knew each other. They got inspiration from each other. They gave inspiration back to each other. There was a meaningful dialogue, meaningful in the sense not necessarily that they talked a lot to each other, that they hobnobbed, meaningful in the sense that their works were seen, learned from, appreciated. Each gave energy to the other. And from that Renaissance burst onto the whole Western stage the Renaissance movement that led to Shakespeare and other great artists and writers all over the West. And we see that it came from really just a handful of people. A handful of people, a fortuitous circumstance of a nobleman who could stake them to living this way for their art and not having to go out and just sell their souls for money. But it all came from a few people and a concentrated few. They generated the energy. It seems to take more than one person. You get one person alone, and the magnetism isn't as strong. If Jesus had talked without getting disciples, I don't think that leaping the gap of that generation, he would have touched other people. It wasn't he alone who did it. He himself said, "Where two or more are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." That is to say that a group of people, he, with his disciples, were able to generate that kind of magnetism that made it possible to reach out and touch the lives and souls of so many other people. And so it is that here, in our age today, we have almost something that's working against greatness. We have the simple fact, for example, that you can hardly say anything in America and be heard unless you overstate it. There's a story of a Hollywood writer who came in after his script had been read by the director to ask how he liked it, and the director said, "It's stupendous, it's colossal." And the writer said, you mean you don't like it? It seems as if you can't get by with anything but the most colossal exaggerations. Every novel you pick up in a bookstore is the greatest of at least the decade, hopefully of the century. Otherwise, it's not worth reading. And so it is that where all really worthwhile works are understated, in order even to get a hearing in this day and age, you have to overstate. But when you get a group of people, such as we have here at Ananda, such as we have in groups around the country that are beginning to pick up this idea and to work together, then you find that that idea begins to develop a meaningful context. You don't have to shout. You just are with people who are friends. You're with people who understand, and because of their understanding, you know how it is when you go into a place and you say something very meaningful and everybody sort of changes the subject and says what's on TV, you sort of lose heart. It isn't only that you think, well, these slobs don't understand. It's that you begin to think, well, maybe what I said wasn't really all that smart. But when you find that people tune into it, and there's a going back and forth, and each one gives to the other, and then each one corrects the other and says, no, let's do it this way, let's do it this way. And so, bit by bit, a real vortex of energy builds up. Then you've got a force that can really change the course of destiny. It can change a whole civilization. I am absolutely convinced that that's what's going to happen from this World Brotherhood movement. And I want to make it clear that to me it's a movement, it's not a place. The place is a wonderful focal point. The place is a wonderful place for people, you and me specifically, to be. But we're doing something that can inspire people to do similar things elsewhere. Do it in their way. It doesn't matter. Shakespeare wasn't Dante. And let's thank heaven for it. He did his thing and did it better. But each one adds something to it. When there's some sort of meaningful and new vortex of energy that people can tune into, and just as I was saying yesterday, that so often the solution to our problems is not to keep thinking about the problem, but to get away from the problem and come in on a new wavelength. Look for a new way to look at it. Look for a new angle. Don't keep fussing and going in circles and getting angry about some little thing and upset about some little thing. Put it aside. There's a lovely story of a Zen monk who was asked in for an examination, and they asked him something about a vase, and he studied the matter and then took a sweeping blow at the vase, smashed it to smithereens, and walked out. And they said, he's understood. Because the problem didn't concern the vase. The problem didn't concern looking at this present and existing thing. It concerned with sweeping that away to go toward something higher. And so it is that we, each time, when I read the writings of people who are trying to write relevantly to our age, I see that they've all proposed their own little tiny closed-in sort of arena to fight in. And each one is sort of, he can't get out of it, because they're all addressing problems in terms of old definitions, old ways of looking at things, old energies, and they can't even come up with a new vocabulary. It's just, it can't break out of the self-enclosed enclosure that they've built. It's something like St. Thomas Aquinas when he said that the cornerstone of Catholic dogma is that Christ said to St. Peter that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church. And this church is the Catholic Church. How do we know that it's the Catholic Church that Jesus meant? Because the Catholic Church says that it's the Catholic Church that he meant. And so you find a perfect argument in a circle. You can't break out of it. But Yogananda, possibly even ignorant of the fact that that circle existed, at any rate not bothering to deal with that at all, said that Jesus was talking about cosmic consciousness. As he was when he said, destroy this temple. He was talking of something mystical. He wasn't talking of the temple in Jerusalem. As he said, when I have meat to eat, and they were looking in his pockets for a sandwich, but he said that my meat is to do the will of the Father. My meat is something mystical, something much higher. When he used these down-to-earth terms, we must remember he didn't build a church personally. He was talking always mystically. Thou art Peter. Petros means rock in Greek, and I presume that that comes from the Aramaic for Peter, but I don't know my Aramaic very well. Let's say I've forgotten my Aramaic. That's a technique of one-upsmanship. You don't have to learn a language. All you have to do is say, well, I've forgotten my Swahili. So I've forgotten my Aramaic. And so whatever the word is, but it means rock. And thou on this rock, what Peter had shown was the bedrock of intuition that helped him to see what Jesus really was, that he was the Messiah. And because of that intuition, that intuitive understanding of the real meaning of Christ's mission on earth, Christ was able to say, I will build my church on this intuition. On the bedrock of this intuition, I will be able to build my church of cosmic consciousness. This is what Yogananda explained. But what we find is that those fresh and wonderful explanations don't come as long as we're sort of busy looking at the pattern on the ground that somebody else has laid for us. We've got to be able to pull our eyes away from that and to create a completely new energy if we're ever to find really new, vital, dynamic, important solutions to the problems of life. And it's exciting to live here. It's so wonderful. I remember going to a restaurant couple of years ago or something, and there was a family, a group of people, friends perhaps, I'm not sure, sitting next to us at the table, at their table. And I found myself listening inadvertently, and I don't normally eavesdrop, but I was so intrigued by the fact that these people were talking intelligently. They were saying interesting things. And I thought how seldom that happens. Most people, when they're together, and you see the ball game last night, yeah, well, I'm sure glad the Braves won. Is it Braves? And so on it goes, and they just don't seem to get anywhere. But how many people do you know who really talk interestingly? Here we have fascinating conversations at Ananda, because there's this interest in how these things apply to so many different fields of life, to the arts, to dance, to music, to business, to philosophy, it's a wonderful thing, even on that level, where there's this constant sharing. You know, when you look at the paintings in the catacombs outside Rome, you see that the people there were, artistically speaking, pretty unsophisticated. But there's a vitality in their paintings because they felt deeply what they were doing. They felt it, and their feeling made it wonderful art. And so it is that the death of art is when people concentrate too much on form. And the vitality of art is when form is secondary. The apex of art is when the two meet. But the most important thing of all is that inspiration, which a few people, if they can separate themselves enough from all the noise and turmoil and all the problems of the day and just concentrate on creating their own solutions, more and more people will begin to see how vital these solutions are and how they really are solutions to the day-to-day problems which most people now think, well, they've got to solve the problem of the ghettos by this, by that, by the other thing. They've got to solve this problem and that problem, ban the bomb and get rid of nuclear power and all these different things which are really sidelines compared to changing people's consciousness. I know one woman who dedicated years and years of her life, maybe she's still dedicating them, to campaigning against fluoridated water. Well, it's good to have a cause, but I would like to think of a cause that was somewhat struck a little more closely to home. Somebody's got to do that. All right, let them do it. But there are issues that are much more important, because once you've got unfluoridated water, or conversely fluoridated water, whatever side you're on, what have you actually done to change anything? The world just keeps bumping along. And it's bumping on a pretty downhill grade right now. What is going to change the world is not new laws for peace. It's a new consciousness of peace. This, friends of mine were saying, Evie and Joe were saying just the other day that they were giving a seminar, and they asked people different degrees of interest that they had. And that which included being able to have more time to pursue spiritual goals received about, what was it, 60%, Joe, of affirmative response. That's wonderful when you find people starting to think that way. You know, when a group of people live and send out this thought into the ether, people tune into that thought without knowing where it even came from. But there is this growing need for spiritual awareness that people are feeling. And it's this sort of thing that's making that possible. It's almost, you might say, the sort of satanic side to that that makes both communities come up that are totally detrimental to that ideal, and secondly, publicity come up that says that they're all detrimental to any kind of ideal. Because in truth, there's a great deal of power for goodness going on right now. Not dogmatic, not bigoted, not denouncing anybody, but just living in a higher way, living more for God. That's what this thing is all about. Back in the medieval times, more before then, I mean, back in the so-called Dark Ages, they were indeed Dark Ages, when all the Vandals and the barbarians came in from the north down into the civilized world of that time and were destroying. If it hadn't been for the monasteries, that old civilization would have been destroyed. But the monasteries kept that light of civilization burning and created a vortex of power that made everybody who had some kind of high ideal say, let's enter those monasteries. And so it was that the monastic movement spread like wildfire. It changed the whole course of Western civilization, and it made its core a spiritual core, which we've managed pretty thoroughly to betray, but nevertheless, that was what saved the West, nothing else. In this day and age, we find, in one sense, just the opposite. All those monasteries that were built are becoming depleted. When I was in Jericho, the Mount of Temptation there's a monastery near the top. And I asked somebody how many monks live in that monastery, and they said, well, there were 6, but a couple of months ago one of them died. Now there are 5. Any young ones? No, they're all old men. I passed a huge monastery on a mountaintop outside Brunico, between, rats, I suddenly forget the name. Anyway, a huge monastery. And I said, how many monks live there? None. The monasteries are being depleted everywhere. People don't feel that the answer to it all is to get away from it all. The answer to it all is to spiritualize it all. And yet, as they try to spiritualize it all, they find that they're caught in old ways of doing things. They don't know how to do it because they're looking at the ground. They're looking at the patterns that are already set there in that mosaic on the floor. And they don't know how to get out of that self-created labyrinth. There's a labyrinth in Pompeii, right in mosaic on the floor. And if you mentally get into it, it'll be a very hard thing to get out again. Maybe you can't get out. I don't know. I didn't try. But the answer is to stop looking at the floor. There isn't a labyrinth anyway if you look around you. We create our labyrinths. And then we say, how can I get out? The answer is to stop looking where the labyrinth is. The answer is to become solution conscious, not problem conscious, not problem oriented. The answer is to create new environments, to create places where people can live in a way that people can relate to. And thus it is that this idea is the new monastery. The monastery of the 6th century, the 9th century, this is the monastery of this century. A monastery in the sense that here people live for God. They don't live for ego. They live thinking that all that I own, I give to thee. But they have families, they have children, they have schools, they have businesses, but they share it with everybody instead of thinking I and mine. And in the process, they create a new way of looking at things that everybody, bit by bit, begins to pick up on, at least all those who are sensitive. And wherever they live, they begin to see that, well, that's how one can live. Why not? It worked for them. Why shouldn't it work for me? We have to have the courage to make it work for us. And then when people see that it works, and when they see that it works for many people, not just for 1 or 2 especially gifted or fortunate individuals, then they begin to say, well, why not give it a try? And so even here, in the beginning, the only people who would come here were poor people, young people being poor, They didn't come from poor families, but they had nothing to lose, nothing to risk, and so they were able to come. The older people with a lot to risk didn't dare. Now we find people in all age groups and from all income backgrounds because they see that it's secure and they don't have anything to lose. It's working. But they do want to live for God. And so to have communities like this, and as Yogananda said, this idea will spread like wildfire. I very much think that this is the truth. I very much think that it's starting to happen right now. And then another thing that we would like to have as a sort of an offshoot of this is a minister's training program so that people who don't feel like living in a community like this, but yet to be funnels for this energy to people out there in the world who want to live a spiritual life and to live for God rather than just working to build up their own bank account, that they could start churches in the cities and serve people in a spiritual way and be, as it were, the vanguard of this movement, because they're out there touching people directly who otherwise wouldn't come to a removed spot like this. But I see it happening. You see it happening. What I was saying 18 years ago was a dream, and many people just laughed and said it was ridiculous and it couldn't possibly work. Now they're seeing that it not only works, but it's wonderful. This is the pattern for the future. This is how we can create that environment that will make change possible. Environment that will encourage your own efforts to grow spiritually, instead of every time you go to work you're surrounded by a bunch of snarling people who are thinking only in terms of getting as much work out of your hide as possible in order to get more of an income. Here we're working with people who love working for God, not for profit, not for being efficient in a business-like way. A lot of people come here and because of their business experience, they laugh at our way of doing business. But it works for us, and we have fun in the process. I think that fun is a great deal more important. I remember somebody saying to Yogananda one time, "What are the assets of this organization?" And he replied joyfully, "None. Only God." And that's why I used my entire inheritance from my parents to build that house up so that you all could enjoy it, rather than just sitting on it and having a nest egg for my old age. I figure that if I come down with some dread disease, I'd rather die and get it over with than spend all that money on hospitals, and in the meantime, I and all of us will have had a great time. So if I go tomorrow, it doesn't matter to me. But while we're here, we might as well have a good time. And if we can do it without attachment, then we can do it. Otherwise, well, we'll lose it all. We'll lose our happiness, we'll lose peace of mind, we'll lose everything. But to live this way for God and just say it's all yours, then what a joy it is. What a joy it was yesterday to have so many of you over there. And today we'll have another group, and each time another group there to just sort of share together in a lovely way. This kind of one of our basic mottos at Ananda is, people are more important than things. People are more important than things. Friendship is more important than success, because friendship is success and money is just nothing. And so to introduce into this materialistic country that on one level would seem not to be open to any kind of thinking like this, a concept that seems so contrary to some of its basic precepts of money madness, would seem madness in itself, except for the fact that the whole world is money mad. There's some reason why we've got it and they don't. Energy. Spiritual energy, in fact. I've done a great deal of traveling, and I haven't seen a country more spiritual than America. It's odd. Apart from the materialism, this country was founded on spiritual values. It was founded because people wanted to find the freedom to worship God in their way. South America was founded on the search for gold. They're still just having one trouble after another. But whatever else has happened here, that has been sort of the core of the American consciousness, a consciousness of which many people are almost embarrassed, and yet it's still there. people who write for the papers and write reviews for books and so on, they, in a sort of very awkward, gauche, embarrassed, feet-shuffling way, say, well, I happen to be one of those people who believes in God or life after death. Or very few of them will say it, and they feel awkward if they do believe it. It's strange that we have that embarrassment about something we should be proud of. But nevertheless, this is the country where such a community as this can happen. I'm not sure it could happen anywhere else in the world. I think from the example here it will start to happen elsewhere. But this is where it could start. This movement, pockets of this kind of energy, here, there, everywhere, and people will begin to flood toward this way of life because it's the only sane way to live, to be with people who care for you, people who will pick you up if you fall, people who will help you when you're in need, people with whom you can share. I don't know why everybody doesn't join this kind of life. I really don't. It's such a wonderful way to live. But I believe that more and more people in their thousands are going to see it, and that this is going to become that kind of focus that will indeed provide, suddenly, people will begin to see, hey, wait a minute, these are answers. These are things we can do to change this world that we're living in, that we don't have to live in mutual hatred and distrust and fear, that we can live like brothers and sisters, that we can live in harmony. Why not? It's not impossible. Nowadays, you turn on the television, and the first thing you see is somebody shooting somebody, shouting at somebody, insulting somebody, putting somebody down, and you pretty soon begin to think, well, after all, that's the way people are. Why shouldn't I be that way? At least I'm not as often that way as other people. It's just the calm assumption in many people's minds that there always has to be some sort of ulterior and therefore dark motive. But bit by bit, I think this innocence and sweetness will begin to spread into people's minds, and they'll begin to think, why? Why should it have to be that way? Why shouldn't it be something else? I remember years ago, in fact, I was giving a television interview in Rome, and one of the men in the TV station afterwards said to me, you know, at your age, you should have more lines of pain on your face. I don't see any. It's indecent. And I said, you know, it isn't that I haven't suffered. It's that I found joy that made the suffering worthwhile. And so I didn't remain in that suffering. I learnt the lesson of it, and I felt better for having suffered. He couldn't quite understand, but he had to appreciate, somehow. He had to appreciate at least from afar. This kind of sweetness, of looking at life with an unjaundiced eye, of looking at life with faith, looking at life with joy, of recognizing that that really can be and is the goal of life. This no one man can say. Yoganandas can sprout up here and there, writing all these beautiful things, setting all these beautiful examples. If it weren't for their disciples, if it weren't for their followings, if it weren't for all the people who tune in and say, let's make it possible, it wouldn't happen. But when people begin to see that it's happening, then they start to say, well, gee, maybe I too. That will change this world. Wars won't do it. Relief funds won't do it except temporarily. Laws won't do it. Police forces won't do it. They are all necessary and important, but they're stopgap measures. They're putting your thumb in the dike. They're not repairing the dike. This will repair the dike. This will help people to see that we can live in a godly way, that we can live for God, in God, with God, and thus know joy always. That's what He put us here for. He didn't put us here to suffer. We get out of joy and into suffering when we turn our backs on Him. But to live for Him need no longer be an impractical dream. It can be something for everybody. And that's the lesson of our age. Bless you.